Hey there, just before we get into the podcast, a quick reminder we could use your financial help. Please support us on Patreon so we can keep on keeping on. Check the Patreon links to donate. Hope you enjoy this episode.
Hi, welcome to Talking Books and Stuff, the program that talks all about books and writing and stuff. Here's your host, Dennis Rimmer.
And once again, you are tuned in to Talking Books and Writing and Stuff. Dennis Rimmer here, and today on the line from Ontario, but he does have Saskatchewan roots, and he's been all over the country, Ted Barris. Ted Barris, a number of books are out there. I've got a couple in front of me right now. Deadlock in Korea, Ted, and it says here to Dennis, many thanks for your interest. You didn't have to follow me to Saskatoon. That was in April of 99.
Well, thank you for following me. That was wonderful. I appreciate it.
And another one I have is Days of Victory, Ted Barris and Alex Barris, with a introduction by Knowlton Nash. And so let's start at the beginning as usual, Ted. First time I heard about you being an author was something about steamboats on the Saskatchewan. So
that's right.
What was that all about? Obviously steamboats, but...
Yeah, you may or may not remember. I can't remember when we met, but I know that I first came to Saskatoon in 1972, and I was fresh out of Ryerson Polytechnical Institute, and I actually, one of the things when I arrived for my sort of day job in Saskatoon at CFQC, I was, let me just go back. I'm gonna pick that up again. My arrival in Saskatoon in 1972 was kind of interesting. I was fresh out of Ryerson Polytechnical in Toronto as a broadcaster, and one of my applications landed at the University of Saskatchewan. And for some reason or other, they needed somebody with basic television and radio and writing and producing and directing skills, and I fit the bill, and they hired me. So I came out in 72. I landed in 1972 on the 31st of January, and it was minus 52 when I stepped off the plane. I almost got back on the plane and went back to Toronto. But what happened was, while I was working for the university, I became very close friends with a number of my colleagues working in the audiovisual unit at University of Saskatchewan in those years. Among them was a man you have interviewed, Alan Bradley.
And my wife...
And Alan...
Yeah.
And Alan, of course, after his time as a technical producer at the AV unit at the University of Saskatchewan, he went on to a very illustrious career as a novelist, writing those wonderful novels about the young woman who's the detective assisting Scotland Yard, right?
Right, Flavia Deluce.
Great character, and in fact, he was shaping her in his mind when he and I would sit after a number of production hours in the studio at the U of S. We would sit at a pub out in Sutherland, out, I think, east of the city, probably because it was open, the latest of all the pubs we used to visit. And we would regale each other with things that we were dreaming about as writers. And Alan hit me one day with this thing. He said, I'm going to show you something that I think you should check out. And he showed me a photograph of a triple-decked paddle wheel steamboat with twin smokestacks, 200 feet long, looking for all the world in the photograph like it had been photographed on the Mississippi in the 1830s. And I said, Mississippi? And he said, nope. I said, sure looks like it. He said, sure does, but it's not. And he had me guess where it was. Turns out it was Fort Edmonton on the North Saskatchewan River in the 1860s. And I was blown away because I thought, how in the heck did a steamboat like that get up in that country? Well, it turns out that that was the first little morsel of information from which I began building my first book called Fire Canoe, which is a a Plains Cree translation of the word that the First Nations people used to describe steamboats. They were canoes with fire coming out of them. And that was the first step into my first book, studying what had been an absolutely incredible period in Western Canadian history, the flourishing of steamboats on the rivers and waterways across what is now Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta in a time before the railways. And Alan challenged me. He said, "Ted, you're going to write a book about this." And indeed I did, and it was published in 1977. And the rest is history.
The rest is history. So that was your first book?
It was 1977, same day, same year that our first daughter was born in Saskatoon in 1977.
Well, there you go, double birth to celebrate.
Yeah, very much so.
This is Talking Books and Stuff with Ted Barris today. Ted, let's back up again a bit. And where did the Ted Barris story begin?
Well, I was born in Toronto in 1949. I am the son of Alex Barris and Kay Barris. My dad, whose name may be familiar to some of your listeners, was a columnist in the Toronto Globe and Mail for many years, later the Toronto Telegram. After that, he became, or coincidentally, he was also involved in broadcasting as a host of a jazz radio program, then went on to television shows, had his own show called the Barris Beat, which was the same name as his column in the Globe and Mail, went on to create such television programs as Front Page Challenge, which was the country's longest-running TV panel show. He probably wrote in his lifetime well over 800 scripts for television, film, and other production, radio and television. And from that kind of an environment, I was sort of smitten by broadcasting right from the get-go. So when I finished high school in East End, Toronto, I decided to attend what I thought was the best broadcasting school in journalism and production, Ryerson, and it was there that I began to train myself as a more schooled broadcaster than my dad had. My dad did it sort of by rote or by experience. I learned some of the basics at school. And then, as I said, when I graduated, I was fully intent on becoming a rock music reviewer and a rock music broadcaster, having my own show and doing my own reviews. And it looked for all the world as if that's the route I was going to take, because Warner Brothers Records was interested, and they planned to hire me as what was called an A&R representative, an artist and repertoire representative. In plain language, I would have become a kind of a rock music scout, which was great. That the office was going to open in Yorkville in downtown Toronto in the late 1960s. What could be better?
What could be better?
It would have been fabulous.
Yes.
Well, oddly, in the fall of that year, after I had been given the job crashed. It didn't happen. And they were very apologetic that they had given me the opportunity, but for some reason, all the pieces didn't fall into place, and they canceled the job. And they said, "You can stay on with the company at Warner Brothers if you want." I said, "No, I think I want to go back to broadcasting." And that's when I got the call from the University of Saskatchewan to come west. And I had never worked outside Ontario before in my life. So this was a great opportunity for me to learn something about another part of the country. And within a few days, I was meeting people such as Alan Bradley. I was falling in love with prairie culture and prairie literature. I met a young woman at that time working at a lab at the University of Saskatchewan named Jane McCauley, and she later became my wife. And all the wonderful parts of my life that began in the prairies, as you say, in a way, my second home, began to make sense, and we lived there for quite some time.
Wow. Now, as a kid, you were not then rebelling, because we're exactly the same age, more or less. I was born also in 1949. I also went to BCIT, the West Coast version of Ryerson. And I also worked at CFQC. So you didn't rebel against Daddy's profession, I take it.
No, not at all, Dennis. My dad did not say to me, "Ted, you must become a broadcaster and a journalist." because that had been his life. But he did insist that I go to university because he had not had the chance to do that. When he came back from the Second World War, one of the things I didn't mention was that my dad, Alex, was born in New York City. So his experience in the Second World War as a veteran was as an American veteran, and we'll talk about that at some point. He was a medic. But after the war, he moved to Canada, and never having had a university education whatsoever, he learned journalism and broadcasting by on-the-job experience, training, sort of learning on the go. So I took the more traditional route, and then I considered at the end of high school other options. I loved history and I loved language. I considered teaching, and I considered becoming maybe a diplomat or something, because I loved French and German and Latin and that sort of thing. But then it became plain as the nose on my face that broadcasting was really what I was keenest about, and so that was the first love and the more natural progression. And in fact, my dad was very encouraging, and while he didn't sort of open doors for me by saying, "Hey, would you give my son a job?" In fact, he went out of his way not to do that. And I learned on my own, and I got my own breaks. But then eventually, Dad and I worked together. As you pointed out, we did a book. We did 2 books together. We co-hosted many radio shows on CBC Radio. We co-hosted a number on television. Dad and I were in lockstep in so many ways because we loved storytelling. We loved broadcasting. We loved speaking and being on air and sharing stories of our discoveries of interesting people and events, some present, some past. My dad was a walking encyclopedia of jazz music, among many things. And so whenever we got on the air, his interest in jazz and my interest in pop music really was a wonderful mesh. And in fact, one of the series of shows we did on CBC for a number of years was called Barris and Barris. And he would do show items about musicians he'd met in his era in the 1930s and 40s in New York City, all those jazz musicians. And because my focus had been right after during my Ryerson years and even when I moved out to Saskatchewan, following and reviewing musical acts in pop music areas, I was doing the same there. So we had this wonderful cross-pollination of our 2 fascinations for music and our joy of being able to talk about it, and it was like dueling musicians on the air talking about our love of music.
And when did you switch over, I guess, to full-time book writing? Is that actually what you do now?
It is. I've always written books, ever since the first one was published in 1977, but it's always been kind of a second aspect to my life. Anyone who writes in this country knows that making a living by writing books is not is really saved for the very few, the Margaret Atwoods and the Pierre Burtons and so on, who did that. So I was doing it as a kind of partly as a hobby, but more so as I began to get some success with the writing, particularly the military stuff. I suddenly began to realize that it was not just on a corner of my plate, but a good large portion of it. And so much of what I was doing in the center of my life, whether it was teaching or journalism, or in the case of working at CFQC on the air when I did all those years from as a freelancer from 1972 to 74, and then on staff producing the Wall and Den show from 1976 to 1980, I was doing the writing on the side to kind of kindle that fascination for history and then military history, more as an area to explore than as a hobby, and to help my writing grow. Because as you know, when you move from one piece of writing to the next, you discover the errors you made in the previous draft or the previous form of your life, and you begin to build on your greater awareness of the craft and the profession and the subject matter, and you discover more joys in the writing, and it really began to take over my life. Then, at one point, after having worked in various parts of the country, in Alberta and Saskatchewan, Manitoba, out on the coast, and other parts of eastern Canada, I was invited to teach at Centennial College, which is a community college based in Toronto. It began in 1967. But in 1999, there was an opening for a part-time position as a professor of journalism. And I was invited to apply to fill in for a couple of years. And then 18 years later, I retired from my professorship and went back to writing books full-time. And that was just 2 years ago. So the books have always been there, Dennis. The writing of long-form manuscripts has been a passion of mine since the days of Fire Canoe and the Steamboats. And so my 19th book just came out this past fall. It's been another stream in my life that's as important to me as my family and other professions.
19 books? Wow. I think I've written 19 shopping lists, maybe. Tell us a bit about your most recent book. It's all about medics and, like you said, people who run into trouble to get shot at while they're trying to help people who were shot.
Well, as I've said very often in my presentations, Dennis, this past fall, and I've been on the road almost constantly since August of last year until this new year when I've sort of taken a bit of a break. I did, I think, something like 95 talks in 100 days.
Oh.
Between the end of the summer and Christmas on Rush to Danger. But the book goes back 56 years. I'm just now in my 71st year. And when I was a teenager, when I was 14, I was in a bad accident. And my dad, who was then a freelancer, he was working at home, sort of distracted me from the pain I was in from this accident while I was recovering at home. My dad was working at home as a writer, doing all these radio and television projects and so on. And he would come into my bedroom and when I was awake and feeling some pain, and he would regale me with stories. And I popped the big question. I said to him, this is about 1963. I said, Dad, what'd you do in the war? And he began to tell me, as only Alex Barris, the great storyteller, could, some of the funniest stories I've ever heard about medics in the American Army. Now, that's when I discovered his American military past, but he never told me the tough stuff. He told me all the funny stories.
Right.
How when he was in training to become a medic, they went out to Kansas, which was for him the ends of the earth. Remember, he was born in New York City, so the extent of his geographical travel was from one end of the New York subway system to the other, basically.
And in the 20s and 30s, just about, New York City was like the center of the universe. You had everything there. You had the great radio shows, the great newspapers, the great Broadway shows, music, jazz, and you name it. And a kid growing up at that era would just probably be in hog heaven.
And in so many ways more than even you could imagine. My dad grew up in the Depression. He was born in 1922. So for him, the only joy that he got from that experience of the life that he and his mother and his older brother and older sister had at that time was that all the work that he did whenever he was contributing to the family's income, his reward from his mom was enough money to go downtown and to Manhattan and to go to some of the movie theaters and the theaters where jazz performers were playing. That was his gift. That was his reward. So you're absolutely right. He was absolutely imbued in that. It was his go-to place was show business. So this guy, when the war breaks out for the Americans, it begins in 1941 after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. His draft notice comes up, and he goes in to respond to the draft, and they've lost his file. And they don't know where to send him, and he'd just as soon not handle a weapon. So they said, fine, we need medics. You'll become a medic. And they sent him to Kansas to become a medic. My dad had absolutely zero medical experience at all. And his sort of study of becoming a medic was essentially confined to anatomy and first aid. And he knew in 1942 when he was training in Kansas and then on to Mississippi and then into New York to board the Queen Elizabeth to go overseas, he knew the proof of his ability to become a medic would only be tested in the war when he actually landed in the middle of a battle scene. Ugh. And he didn't have to wait too long.
And this is Ted Barris with us on Talking Books and Writing and Stuff, talking about many books, 19 of them, and all Deadlock in Korea, rather is one of them. Ted Barris and Alex Barris have Days of Victory. Ted's latest is Rush to Danger. So we're carrying on now with our conversation with the one and only Ted Barris, based now in the Toronto area.
Dennis, a pleasure. And I really feel strongly that my dad's story, while it sort of captured me when all those years ago when I was a teenager, it took a long time for it to kind of seep through what I was doing. As you know from following the writing that I've done in other books, I went from doing a book about steamboats to doing a book about hockey or two, doing a book about rodeo, and on and on and on. In the 1980s, I tripped over a military story which I had never seen before and which I felt might be worth exploring. And even though I had grown up in pretty much a pacifist family, my dad, coming out of the experience he had in the Second World War, was not particularly keen to have me playing around with weapons or guns or whatever. And so, that was the last thing in the world he thought I'd be interested in. But suddenly I began running into veterans and asking them questions and discovering their stories popping out, and I had this magical connection with them for some reason. I'm sure that many of your listeners, when asked the question, what do you know about your mom's or your dad's experience during the war, would probably say to you, I don't know. They never talked about it.
They never did. Nope.
And I had the luxury, the gift of thousands and thousands of memories. Dennis, I probably interviewed somewhere between 6,000 and 7,000 veterans over the 40 or 50 years that I've been doing this. And as a consequence, I guess I felt a bit of a responsibility, and they felt very safe in my taking that gift of their memories to translate it to these books. Anyway, after 18 books, half of which had been military, I suddenly remembered that experience with my dad in 1963 and recognized that many of the voices in my collection of audio files and so on that had never been tapped, had never really been called upon, were the surgeons in the military, the nurses in the military, the ambulance drivers, the stretcher bearers, the medical corpsmen, the orderlies, the dentists, all those people whose stories I'd listened to but never incorporated into books. I'm going to pause here and cough. Hold on a second.
That's okay. We don't mind when people cough. It's that time of year. This is Talking Books and Such and Stuff in Writing. Ted Barris is with us today on the line from back east. His latest book is called Rush to Danger. Other ones include Fire Canoe, Deadlock in Korea, Days of Victory with Ted Barris and Alex Barris. Introduction by Knowlton Nash to that one, and I talked to that guy once a long time ago. What a great guy he was. And now Ted is back, so you have lots of these stories that were just sort of not hanging around, percolating around, I guess, and suddenly the light bulb went on, as you say, and that became Rush to Danger.
Because my father's story had been hanging there, and he had given me a certain amount of more of the funny side, the lighter side of his experience, the deeper I probed into military stories and did all those stories, whether it was Days of Victory or Deadlock in Korea or Behind the Glory, the story about the air training plan, or another book I did about post-traumatic stress among soldiers called Breaking the Silence. All those things had kind of driven me to a point that I began to realize that one large gap in my writing experience was exploring my dad's story on paper or on a computer keyboard. And when my dad died in 2004, while I had a lot of information, I recognized that I had to do some more research. And so I began to go back to the States, where his story originated. I had some family members who could remember what it was like in New York when he joined, including his older brother, who survived him for a few years. I had access to his military records at the major clearinghouse of military records in St. Louis, Missouri, and I got all his records from there. I discovered that the military infantry division, that his medical battalion, again, he was a medic in the American Army, and the unit he was attached to was the 94th Infantry Division, which was part of General George S. Patton's Third Army, beating back the Germans after in the Battle of the Bulge in late 1944-45, which was that period within which Dad really learned how to become a medic. Anyway, all of their records, I discovered, were housed at a university campus rare books library in the University of Georgia, so I went there. But what probably became the most gelling, the most significant element of connection with my dad's story came from my sudden discovery that I might be able to find men who had served with him. And based on the records that I found at the University of Georgia, I found a list of living members of the 94th Infantry Division and the 319th Medical Battalion, the one that my dad had been serving in. I found a man alive who, when I called him, I discovered knew my dad and had served with him, a guy named Tony Malachi in New Jersey. And so I packed up immediately. I mean, I don't think the telephone was on the receiver down for more than a day, and I was out of the house and on the road to New Jersey to meet Tony. And he told me things and showed me things that I never knew about my dad. We all know Alex Barris as a very much a professional writer and broadcaster after the war here in Canada when he moved here from the States. I didn't realize he was a frustrated writer during the war. No. Meaning that Tony had, for example, when he and Dad met in Kansas in training, Tony said that your dad started the 1st Medical Battalion newsletter for the unit in Kansas. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, he became the publisher, the editor, the chief reporter, the chief editorialist, and the guy who put the whole newsletter together. And he even invented the name for the newsletter for the Medical Battalion. It was called the Weekly Dose, which I thought was great. Anyway, it turned out that Tony, after all these years, had saved many of these newsletters.
Oh, come on. You're pulling my leg.
Yeah.
What?
It was right there, a pile of them. And it was a gold mine, because here was my dad speaking from the war, a voice I'd never heard, through the writings that he had done of this newsletter. And Tony gifted those to me and allowed me to, again, hear my dad's voice from that period. And then what Tony told me, even more dramatic than that, Dennis, Dad and Tony ended up in the Battle of the Bulge. Now, my dad was what was called a runner. He was operating as a medical corpsman between the battle area, the zone where men were fighting and dying, back behind the lines to the first aid station. And that was my dad's job, was to get stretcher bearers and medics to the battle area and get men back from the Battle of the Bulge to this first aid station in a little place called Borg. And at that first aid station, Tony, who was the head of the motor pool, he would get these guys into ambulances and be taken farther back behind the lines. So my dad and he were handing off the wounded to each other. And Tony told me that in February of 1945, on a day when they had been dealing with no fewer than 119 wounded in 12 hours in the middle of this battle, Dad lost track of 2 stretcher bearers and 2 medics out in the battle area. And it wasn't until late in the evening, after he dispatched them to go and bring back wounded, that he realized they hadn't come back. And I said, Tony, what are you talking about? And he said, your dad, at the end of that day, went back through the area that had been a minefield through which many of the men had walked and set off mines earlier in the day. Your dad set off in the night to find the 2 dispatched medics and stretcher bearers, and he found them wounded and disoriented in the battlefield, and in the darkness brought them out. Oh. I was absolutely blown away, Dennis. I never knew any of this. And then I said, how do you know all this? He said, well, Tony said, about 3 weeks later, when our medical battalion was at rest, the captain of the medical battalion called the battalion together on a parade ground and had everybody at attention, called out my dad, and read out a citation articulating exactly what I described to you. And this guy presented my dad with what was known as the Bronze Star, which is a medal for bravery.
Yes.
And Tony told me all this, and you could have knocked me over with a feather.
Because you didn't know this at all?
No, I didn't. I later discovered in his dad's papers, the citation for the Bronze Star, but I did not know the details of it, and Tony gave them to me. So you can imagine after my dad's in the grave for 15 years,
Yeah.
I get this information from a man who I hadn't known, save the fact that I'd found his name in a list in Georgia, and who suddenly gives my dad's experience shape and form and a vividness that I could never have expected in my wildest dreams to have discovered on my own.
Holy smokes. That's such a story. I'm speechless. And that, for me, that's something. Rush to Danger is the latest book by the prolific Ted Barris. You can find dozens, almost dozens, more than a dozen of his other books just about everywhere. Ted, are they all still in print?
No. The most recent, say, half dozen or 8 are. Because the publishing industry in Canada is so fickle these days and so much sort of on edge, publishing companies unfortunately go under periodically. The two recent books, Rush to Danger, and the one that came out last year about the famous dams raid in 1943 called Dam Busters, the Canadian story, they are very much still in print with HarperCollins. Previous to that, I'd been published by a company called Thomas Allen, which was Canada's very first publishing company. It goes back to the beginning of the 20th century. And Thomas Allen went out of business, but Dundurn Press picked up all of the inventory and the rights to reprint these books, and so they're reprinting them. So, say 6 or 8 of them are still around, also being printed. But the 2 most recent, Rush to Danger and Dam Busters, are very much in print, and you can find them in better bookstores all across Saskatchewan and across the West.
And a couple more questions quickly, Ted, before we go. Ted Barris is with us today. First day with my new lips, as they say.
That's okay.
You have any advice for people who want to write, especially nonfiction material? What's the best thing you've learned about being a nonfiction writer?
My advice to anybody who wants to write nonfiction is to leave no stone unturned. And sometimes the stones are right in your own backyard. I'm a perfect example of that. When you begin to discover what your roots are, what your family roots are, what your professional roots are, what your genetic roots are, it's amazing. In a way, you're establishing your own little ancestry production house if you begin to explore your own family. Some of those stories are the richest and the most notable and the most compelling because they're close to you, because you know better than anybody else who are the characters, what were the circumstances, and why it was so important. So I would recommend that anybody interested in nonfiction don't go out and try to tell the story of the war or the entire Second World War, First World War, whatever, or the entire world of anything. Look close to what you know. It's that old phrase about write what you know. That's one recommendation I would make. The other thing I would say is, as a nonfiction writer, as any writer, we're always frightened by rejection. We're always fearful that the small company or the big publishing company will turn us down and will deflate us and make us feel insignificant, and that our work was not worth anything. Don't ever be thwarted by that. Don't ever be turned back. Somewhere there is a publisher who is interested, and even if it's yourself, because a lot of people are turning to self-publication as a means of getting their work out there, but there are still publishers, small houses that exist across Canada in nonfiction that are interested in good stories. Any publisher who gets a call from a writer, however fearful he or she may be, is going to be interested in hearing what you have to say if you've got a good story. And those stories can be historical, they can be contemporary. I've never really delved into fiction, and that's a very different world and is much more competitive with agents and agency and international rights and all that sort of stuff. But if you're into nonfiction, believe in your story. My wife, the woman I met 45 years ago in Saskatoon, Jane McCauley, she has a license plate it's one of those vanity plates that she got. She's an equestrian, and she's had many years of ups and downs on the back of a horse, I can tell you, as a dressage rider, and one of her coaches as a dressage competitor told her one day, "Don't be afraid. Be braver. Be braver. So my wife, bless her, she got a license plate, and it reads B space BRAVER. Be braver.
Well,
and I highly recommend that writers of any background, of any genre, be braver. Don't be afraid.
and is there a place we can contact you? A Ted Barris website, anything like that? That's okay.
There is. Sorry.
That's fine.
There is a website. Hang on just a second.
Yep. We're with Ted Barris. He's coughing in the background as he gathers his information about his website. Just go to any bookstore anywhere, look for Ted Barris. There'll be books everywhere, or your library. I got a great tip from our local librarian just the other day. That's why we have Maureen Jennings on talking books and writing and stuff. So we're with Ted Barris, who is going to give us his information about the website.
One of the joys of teaching journalism is working with young women and men who are much more proficient in journalistic technology than I am.
Yes.
And so one of my graduate students, a young man named Phil Alves, I taught him probably 20 years ago. After he graduated, went off and became a journalist on his own. We reconnected later, and he came back to the college where I was teaching and became a professor's assistant, and he became the guru, the guy who was in charge of our website. I went to Phil one day and I said, "Phil, I need a website. Help me." And he said, "I'll see what I can do." And so he went to something called WordPress, which is a very popular website base, and he built me a site. And so my site is a WordPress site, and it's very straightforward. It's at tedbarris.com, and you go to the site, and if you're interested in any of my books, there's a little précis on each of the 19 books. If you're interested in my background, there's a little bit of a description of where I came from, much the same information that Dennis, you and I have been sharing today. And there's an events button. You can find out where I'm actually going to be speaking. I lead tours. My wife, Jane, and I lead tours overseas every year. We go to battlefields, and I tell stories based on my research and writing. We've been to France, we've been to Italy, we've been to England, we've been to Germany, we've been to Belgium and the Netherlands, scores of times, and we take 30, 40, 50 Canadians each trip. And I've got a trip coming up later in the spring. In May, we're going to go to the 75th anniversary of the liberation of the Netherlands between May the 1st and May the 12th. And if anybody's interested, you can sign up for our tour and come along with us. You'll find information about that on my website as well under tours. And there's also a kind of listing of some of my other activities, both in terms of writing magazine articles and newspaper stories. And I've got a column that I write, just the same name as my dad's column. My dad invented the Barris Beat for the Globe and Mail back in the 1940s. And then when he retired, I asked him if I could carry on the name doing the same thing, and he said, by all means. And so the Barris Beat continues. I've been doing it for probably 30 years, a column every week. That works out to about 2.5 million words, I think, Dennis. And so you can find the Barris Beat weekly column that I write on my website as well.
And it's tedbarris.com.
It is.
Simple as that.
It is simple.
And Barris
It has to be, otherwise I could never have access to it.
And that's what she said. Ted Barris, Barris. Ted, thank you very much for an enjoyable visit today, and best of luck today and always.
Dennis, a pleasure. It's a delight to connect with friends in Saskatchewan. Very much my second home, and I'm very honored and proud to be part of your entourage of podcastees. It's been great fun, and carry on the great work.
Thank you. Hey there, Dennis Rimmer here. Thank you for listening to this edition of Talking Books and Such, featuring Ted Barris. And Ted has a question, and actually a request for you and yours. If you know anyone who has been involved in the Battle of the Atlantic. Now, that was back in the Second World War, when the Allies attempted and succeeded in keeping shipping lanes from North America to Europe open so that Britain and England and the Allies, including Russia, could be supplied with goods and services and ammunition and foodstuffs and things like that, while at the same time, of course, they were being harassed by Nazi U-boats and Nazi surface ships as well. So Ted wants stories about the Battle of the Atlantic, be it Navy people, merchant marine, men, women, anybody who has any connection to the Battle of the Atlantic. He would like to hear from you, and you can find his information, of course, on his Ted Barris website, which is easy to find. It's simply tedbarris.com. So thank you very much.
Thank you for visiting with us today. This is Talking Books and Stuff with Dennis Rimmer. Contact him at dennis@talkingbooks.tk. Thank you, and may all the good news be yours. Oh, and don't forget to check out his book, The Great Canadian Notebook, available across Canada and at amazon.ca.